Okay, welcome, brothers and friends, to another edition of Off Script on Purpose. It's SigEp's attempt to talk a little bit about what's going on in SigEp land, things that might be of interest to our undergraduates, to our alums, to our parents, to stakeholders and folks in higher education, everybody that our fraternity touches. This week, we're going to be talking with Gentry McCreary, who is the CEO and managing partner of Dyad Strategies. A lot of folks don't know this, but SigEp has been doing for some odd years now an assessment, a data-driven survey that affects every decision we make about how we spend our money and how we deploy our resources like staff, people, et cetera, et cetera. It helps us, I think, look forward above the horizon to see what's coming at us. And so making data-driven decisions is a good thing. So I want to introduce Gentry to you today. And also, of course, joining us, as always, is Heather Matthews, who is my trusted sidekick and dedicated director of our communications program with Sigma Phi Epsilon. Heather, welcome. Gentry, welcome to you as well.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
What, if you would, is this brotherhood assessment, and just in a nutshell, why do we do it?
The best way to describe it is to kind of describe the genesis of the research. I was writing my doctoral dissertation at the University of Alabama and was writing about hazing. As I was talking to fraternity members, guys kept using the word brotherhood to talk about things, and I just had this realization one day that word means different things to different people. And I had this idea of, well, can we measure the different ways that guys think about brotherhood? And if we can we understand how the ways they think about brotherhood impacts other aspects of chapter culture? But people saw value in the things that we were studying and wanted to use those data points as metrics to use the phrase you're using, to be more data driven, right? To gather data that will really help us understand the way that our members are experiencing their membership in the organization and the attitudes and behaviors and beliefs that they have that really influence the culture of the organization. So in a nutshell, that's what we do. We measure student beliefs and behaviors and attitudes in a way that helps national organizations like SigEp and college campuses just really understand the culture of their chapters. And then over time, the impact of the things that they are doing on the undergraduate chapter experience.
That's terrific. Heather, tell me a little bit about how SigEp, how does it work in SigEp? How do we do it?
Yeah, so every fall, and this was our fourth year doing it, every fall we send our brotherhood survey to every single undergraduate. And so 12,000 people have the opportunity to fill it out. And I think more than half of those do. So we have thousands of responses. I think 53% of our undergraduates did this year. So more than 6,000 people. And really what we're doing is looking to get a pulse on what does brotherhood mean in SigEp? Do people feel like they belong? Are people satisfied with the experience? And also look at some of those things that brotherhood can impact, like hazing behaviors. Gentry talked about that. But as well as, what are the impacts of our programs? What are the impact of having great volunteers involved with the chapter? And really looking at how brotherhood interacts with how our members interact with brotherhood, I would say. So yeah, Gentry, kind of tell us, big picture, is there anything, we know we have great response rates, but what do chapters need to know about the assessment maybe that we haven't covered?
The thing to understand about what that data tells you is that it doesn't tell you everything, but it does tell you a lot about what your members are experiencing. It does tell you a lot about what they think their fraternity experience ought to be. And that's the way I really think about this data. And when I'm talking with undergraduates, I say all the time that I can do a lot. There's a lot of training and education that we can do to help make fraternities better. But the one thing we can't do is wave a magic wand and tell someone that what they thought their fraternity experience was going to be is actually not what it's going to be, right? Why you're joining, that's actually not important. This is actually what it is, that we can't change someone's reason for being there, right? That what they're hoping to get out of the experience is ultimately what they're going to try and get out of the experience. And so the data really tell us a lot about what your members want their fraternity experience to be. It tells us a lot about their attitudes around what they are experiencing. Some good attitudes, right, around brotherhood and affinity and satisfaction. And we measure a number of more problematic attitudes, right? So hazing tolerance, hazing motivation, alcohol use. So looking at the data and looking at it from 30,000 feet and looking at every data point and trying to piece together what do all of these collectively say about how our members are experiencing their time in SigEp.
For sure.
So Gentry, so we've done it now, I think we said 4 years. So what did we learn this year about our brotherhood? I mean, and I'm going to say that up front because we're not the only fraternity that does it. You do it for a number of our peers. So I am going to be interested in probing a little bit about, how we compare to others, because I think our listeners will find that interesting. But let's start with us. What did we learn about our brotherhood this year?
The most important thing I would say that we learned about SigEp this year is that relative to all the groups that we're studying, you all had the best post-COVID recovery, I would say, right? So we had a number of data points begin to shift very significantly in the fall of 2020 after campuses had moved to hybrid, remote, various forms of learning, and the student experience changed drastically. And across the board, we saw changes in our data. We saw increases in alcohol use. SigEp was not immune to that. We saw increases in some hazing attitudes. SigEp was not immune to that. Not surprisingly, we saw decreases in belonging and satisfaction, and SigEp was not immune to that. So SigEp was really not immune to any of the challenges that we saw during that first year of COVID. But what we saw in the most recent batch of data, which really represents kind of year 2 of COVID, as things started to get back to normal on most college campuses, is that more than any other fraternity, SigEp got back to what things were looking like prior to COVID. So what are some data points that tell us that? Sense of belonging is a perfect example. Sense of belonging is an aspect of brotherhood. It's this idea that I feel connected, I feel valued, I feel like I have meaningful relationships with my brothers. That went down, not surprisingly, during the first year of COVID with everyone, including SigEp. And it bounced back up a little bit across the board, but not that much. It basically stayed flat. But in SigEp in 2021, it shot back up to the highest point it's been in the 4 years that we've been gathering this data. So SigEp now has the highest sense of belonging that we've seen in the time that we've been measuring this. SigEp saw a huge spike in satisfaction in the last year. Like everyone else, it went down a little bit during the first year of COVID. Most of our other national groups that we're working with, it stayed flat going into 2021. SigEp spiked back up, now well above the all fraternity average that we have in terms of that overall sense of satisfaction. So some really good news there in SigEp world. One of the other things that we saw in SigEp that I think is really positive and meaningful and makes a difference is that we saw, like everyone else, some increases in alcohol use during the first year in COVID. But SigEp stands out in 2 ways. Number one, those increases were never as much as what we saw in other fraternities. And number 2, and perhaps more importantly, SigEp again in 2021 got back to normal, right? They were the most quick, I guess, of all the fraternities in our comparison data set for both the binge drinking rate as well as the rates of overall consumption to get back to the pre-COVID, quote unquote norm. Whereas again, most of the other fraternities in our data set that we're studying, those elevated drinking rates during the first year of COVID stayed elevated. They stayed flat during the second year of COVID. So we saw SigEp from a health and safety standpoint really improve in year 2 of COVID relative to other fraternities. And in doing so, we saw that sense of belonging and that sense of satisfaction really, really improve. The one area where we saw SigEp you kind of not return back to normal with these post-COVID trends is one of the metrics that we measure related to hazing. We measure these hazing motivations, and one of the motivations we measure is called social dominance motivation. And that's this idea, what we're really measuring there is your attitude around what you think the new member process ought to be. Is it about building solidarity? Is it about loyalty and commitment? Is it about teaching things? Or is it about reinforcing the hierarchy within the group? I'm up here, you're down here, we're older members, you're just a new member, you're just a freshman, you're just a pledge, whatever the language used in a chapter might be. What we saw again across the board, SigEp is not the only group that experienced this, is that during COVID, we saw a huge spike, massive spike, almost a half a point in some cases, and in some cases more than a half a point on a 5-point scale increase in that social dominance motivation. We saw that in SigEp in 2020, and in 2021, that number didn't come back down to normal. It stayed high. So we've got a situation in SigEp where, for whatever reason, because of COVID, members are much more concerned with a new member process that reinforces the group hierarchy, right? I'm up here, you're down here. I've got something that you want. I have power over you. And so any hazing that might be going on in our chapters is much more likely to be being done through the guise of this notion of hazing that's designed to reinforce the hierarchy. If you want what I've got, you have to earn it. You have to do certain things. And we're reinforcing that hierarchy through the things we're asking our new members to do for us. And so that's one area where SigEp kind of looks like everybody else, right? That we really didn't see a difference between you all and the other fraternities we work with. But across the board, we would say the news for SigEp coming out of COVID in the last year is really, really positive.
That's terrific. I mean, I guess we couldn't have expected to get all great news in every organization. If we're doing the data correctly, we're going to find areas where there are opportunities to get better. It sounds like we've discovered some of them, but we often at the board level talk about, if all else fails, if we run out of money and we run out of people, what can't we do well and what can we do well? The one thing that we know that we will always invest in with our last dime is going to be brotherly love. Mm-hmm. SigEp is on a big love kick right now, brotherly love, and we need it, because COVID sucks and we've all been very lonely and very anxious and very isolated over the last couple years. And so there's the windows open, the air's blowing in again, and SigEp is doing brotherly love. So is there anything that the data really can tell us about relationships and brotherly love that isn't obvious to someone like me?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a metric that I've already mentioned. I would argue that similar to your theory, that the most important thing we measure, if you look at all of our data points, the analogy that that I like to use, and it's one that I didn't come up with, my friend Jeremiah Shin came up with this when talking about our data, is that if you're familiar with the movie Moneyball, mm-hmm. that sense of belonging is our on-base percentage, right? Like if you can only focus on one metric, if you're familiar with Moneyball and Billy Bean and his story of using sabermetrics, does he get on base, right? Does this guy get on base? That's what we're going to focus on. And so if you broke all of our measures down and said, well, what's our on-base percentage? What's the thing that matters the most? It would be that sense of belonging. Why? It's connected to so many other things. If sense of belonging is high, you're going to feel other aspects of brotherhood more strongly. You're going to be more likely to want to hold one another accountable. You're going to feel like your brothers have your back. It's going to be more fun. So it's the biggest predictor of the other aspects of brotherhood. It's the biggest predictor of all of the metrics we look at connected to affinity. So your commitment to the group, your sense of identification with the group, your overall satisfaction with your fraternity experience, all the most predicted by belonging. Retention, when you look at retention over time, who stays versus who leaves, I can look at someone's belonging score their freshman year, and I can predict with about 80% certainty whether or not that person will still be in the chapter at the end of their junior year. It's that powerful of a predictor of retention. So when you think about belonging, what is belonging? It means I feel like people care about me. I feel like I matter. I feel like I'm connected and I have meaningful relationships. And to me, that's as analogous to that concept of brotherly love as anything that I can think about, right? That if you feel like you matter, if you feel like you belong, it's because you feel like the people in the group care about you. You are a valued member of the organization. You feel that sense of love. You feel that sense of connection. And that drives so many other positive outcomes. And that's an area where SigEp is doing really, really well. And it shows in the data that as an organization, you've invested a lot of time, energy, resources, communication, Heather's shop, and I see some of the work that they do. So much of what you're talking about revolves around that concept, and it's showing up in the data. Belonging continues to increase, and that's driving a lot of those other metrics. Satisfaction is getting better, commitment is getting better, affinity is getting better. So what I would say is that those investments that you're making in brotherly love are showing up in deeper sense of belonging, deeper sense of connection. We also know that's important because of another issue that we know is on the forefront of a lot of people's minds, especially coming out of COVID. Excuse me. And we knew this before COVID, but it's become even more important during and after COVID. And that has to do with mental health. And when we've started tracking mental health in a new way. We used to look at it just in terms of self-efficacy, but now we're looking at it in an actual kind of well-being scale. So feeling happy, feeling joy in your life, feeling supported in your life, et cetera. About 25%, and we've just piloted this measure with a couple of groups, not SigEp, but in other fraternities that we're looking at, about 25% of that mental health well-being score can be explained by one's sense of belonging. I want you to think about that for a second, that when you look at someone's overall mental health and their overall well-being, a quarter of that can be explained by the extent to which they feel like they belong, are valued, are cared about within their groups. That's an incredibly profound finding that really shows the importance of this focus that you all have, focusing on brotherly love, because when you feel that love, when you feel that connection, you're going to be a happier, healthier person. And I don't think there's anything better that we can do for our brothers than to make them happier, healthier people. And SigEp is doing a lot of really good work in that area. And the data backs that up.
As you talk to undergraduates or volunteers, right? And so if you're a chapter president and you're watching this and you're hearing what you're saying, how do chapters invest in belonging, right? How do they increase connection that makes people feel like they matter? How do they increase their brotherly love, guys, like both of you? I think that's the takeaway. If you're watching this, you see how much it matters. How do they do that?
Chapters with really good brotherhood, particularly really good sense of belonging, have figured out that the purpose of the recruitment process is not to make it, some fun thing. And it's not about necessarily values-based recruitment, which is a term that gets thrown around a lot. And I'm not even sure what it means. But what these chapters have figured out is that recruitment is about building meaningful relationships with people, getting to know them in a deep, meaningful level, and being able to then have both parties involved in the decision-making process, the fraternity and the potential new member, make really well-informed decisions about joining a place where they feel like they're really going to be connected. So they're not joining because they went to some fun parties. They're not joining because the chapter has the most social clout on campus. They're not joining because of any of these other reasons. They're joining because they truly feel like, I got to know people here. I really feel a connection to people here, versus chapters with poor brotherhood. It's all about fun, right? Like, let's just feed them a bunch of beer and, and we'll give them a bid. It's like, oh, he's a cool guy, but did you actually build a meaningful relationship with him during the recruitment process? Or it's this sales pitch, right? It's like trying to sell them on the fraternity and look at all the trophies in our trophy case, and it's all about kind of selling you a product as opposed to just building a relationship with you, and then two parties making a really well-informed decision about where I want to be. So recruitment is really important. The new member socialization process is incredibly important. The latest soapbox I've been on the last couple of years is that I want to stop calling it new member education, because when we call that period of time, that 8-10 weeks, however long at the beginning of the membership process, when we call that new member education, what we're doing is that we're suggesting that the things that you learn during that time period, the education, is the most important thing that happens. And our data suggests that that's not the case, that the most important thing that happens in that process are the relationships that you build, the manner in which you're socialized into the organization. So I think we should be calling it new member socialization, because that is way more important than the things that you learn. And again, when we compare these chapters with strong brotherhood to those with deficient brotherhood, we see distinct differences in terms of how they socialize their new members. They really invest time helping within the pledge class, the guys build deep, meaningful relationships with one another. And the most common way we see that happen is through conversations that are designed to really elicit emotional vulnerability, getting guys to open up and share and talk about things they wouldn't normally open up and share and talk about. And there's a lot of research out there about this and why that thing is so powerful. But we began noticing in chapters with really good brotherhood, they would always point to those conversations they had as new members as the moments when it really started to click for them, right? Like, this is something more than just a place to party on weekends. This is a group of people that I can really count on. This is a group of people I can really trust. This is a group of people that I can tell anything to. And they begin to build those really deep and meaningful connections. These chapters also do a really good job socializing their new members with the older members. Chapters with bad brotherhood tend to rely completely on the big little matching process. So, as a freshman, you're going to maybe meet some sophomores, and one of them will be your big brother, and then it's his job to kind of socially integrate you with the upperclassmen. And that works out great if you've got a great big brother who himself is plugged in and socially integrated within the chapter. But if you don't, then that can be a really isolating experience for new members. And so the chapters that have this figured out know that it's not just the big brother's job to help the new member get socialized, it's everyone's job. So they're really intentionally creating opportunities for those freshmen to get plugged in with the upperclassmen, the juniors, the seniors. We see a really distinct difference in those chapters, especially in terms of the relationship between the freshmen and the seniors. In chapters with bad brotherhood, bad belonging, the dynamic is the seniors want to be respected. We want the freshmen to respect us. You hear that word a lot. In chapters with really good belonging brotherhood, you hear the seniors say things like, we want them to like us and think that we're cool. Like, we want to get to know the freshmen. We want the freshmen to like us and to look up to us. And we want to have a good relationship with them. And so these chapters go out of their way to help facilitate opportunities for that to happen. And then when you look at the social network, if you map it out, you can see the difference between the relationships that get built with the freshmen, not only within his pledge class, but throughout the entire chapter, comparing those two types of chapters against one another. So the new member recruitment and socialization processes are incredibly important. The types of brotherhood activities that you do, small, intimate, designed to promote meaningful conversation, is really important. Chapters that eat meals together more frequently have better brotherhood than those who don't. One of our earliest focus groups we did, and Heather, you may remember this with Delta Epsilon, we noted very early in DU that chapters that had a house had higher belonging than chapters that didn't have a house, which makes sense, right? Because if you have a house, there's a place to come together, to be together. But there was this handful of unhoused chapters in DU that had really, really high belonging scores, right? They totally bucked the norm. And we did some focus groups with those chapters. And one of the most profound things that came out of those focus groups was how often those chapters ate meals together. Something as simple as eating meals together regularly. What are you doing when you're sitting down and eating dinner? you're talking, you're engaging, you're having intimate conversations, you're getting to know one another. And those chapters just figured that out, right? Like we have a place in the student union where we meet and we have lunch every day, or 3 or 4 nights a week, we're meeting at different places and having dinner. Like these chapters just figured that out. So there's a lot that chapters can do to just facilitate meaningful engagement between your brothers. And it doesn't have to be anything complicated. It can be as simple as just eating together more often.
Well, you have officially disrupted a lot of my ideas about how we do our member education and about fraternalism. But, you know, at the end of the day, I think those of us with a little sweat under the saddle know that, again, you strip it all away. It's all about relationships. It's all about fraternalism, if you will, and things like eating together, traveling together, meeting each other's families, singing together, which is unfortunately a little bit of a lost tradition in SigEp, but maybe we'll bring it back, right? Those are things that matter. So I've taken some notes, and I think that data is going to help us. So let me shift gears, if I can, just a little bit. Connected to brotherhood. I know that we want to make sure that men are finding value and satisfaction. You talked about that earlier. Can you talk a little bit more about how we measure value and satisfaction in an organization? Because at the end of the day, our business is selling memberships, and people don't find value and aren't satisfied. That's going to find its way into every nook and cranny of the organization. I want to make sure we're on track.
So in SigEp world, the way we ask it is on a scale of 1 to 10, how satisfied are you with your experience in Sigma Phi Epsilon? So 10 would be incredibly satisfied. 1 would be incredibly unsatisfied, not happy at all. And what we do is we take all that data and we look at all the people who score a 9 or a 10 in this analysis. They're what's called a promoter. These are the people who are incredibly happy. They're having a really good experience to the point that they're not just happy, they're out promoting the product. They're out telling other people how happy they are with the product. I love SigEp. This is a great fraternity. I'm having an amazing experience. They're wearing letters on campus. They're promoting the brand, if you will. So we look at that. And then we look at the percentage of people who score a 1 through a 6 on that satisfaction measure. And they're what's called a detractor. These are the people who are not happy. They are unhappy with the experience. They have had a really bad experience for whatever reason. And so we calculate the percentage in any chapter and then in the overall organization of the percentage of promoters and the percentage of detractors. And you'll notice in this analysis, we ignore the 7s and 8s. The people who score 7 or 8 are in the research what are referred to as passives. They're happy, they're having a good experience, but they're not promoting the organization. They're fine. It's what I expected it to be. So the way you calculate a net promoter score is you take the percentage of promoters, and from that you subtract the percentage of detractors. So you could have a score that ranges anywhere from positive 100. If you had 100% promoters and no detractors, your score would be 100, would be a perfect score. If you had 100% detractors and no promoters, Comcast, right? Then your net promoter score would be negative 100. So any positive score is good. Any score over 40 is considered very good. SigEp currently sits at a 45, right? And that's in the upper echelon of all the groups that we measure. And that's a score that's improved significantly over the last couple of years. It was a little bit higher than that before COVID. Across the board, we saw a big dip during COVID, but SigEp's net promoter score bounced back really significantly from 2020 to 2021, saying that, like we're feeling like we really are getting what we're paying for. We're satisfied with this experience. There are a lot of companies out there that would be thrilled with a net promoter score of 45. So when you look at just, is SigEp delivering a product that people are happy with? Overwhelmingly, the answer to that question is yes.
Well, that's really great news. I guess we'll live to fight another day then. Or I guess it tells us that we're on to something, right? But I'm never satisfied. I always want to get better. And so that tells me we're getting warm. But
one of the interesting things, Bill, is that's always fascinated me as we've looked at this data and it's worth mentioning here. I like to slice and dice all the groups in our data set in a number of different ways. One of the things that we found in the last few years is that the chapters with the groups nationally with substance-free housing policies have higher net promoter scores than those who don't. And I love that data point because it flies in the face of the common argument that you hear anytime a national group, and I've been at conventions when groups were having this conversation about substance-free housing, and the common refrain you always hear from those fighting it are, you're going to ruin the experience. You're going to ruin the fraternity. You're turning this into, whatever, the chess club or what, there's all these arguments, but the common refrain is you're going to ruin the experience if you get alcohol out of the fraternity house. Yet when we look at our data, the opposite is true, that those groups have the highest net promoter scores. The most satisfied fraternity members are those who come from organizations that have substance-free housing. Well, why is that? Because people want to live in the house, because there's not a party going on there all the time. They have meaningful relationships that aren't based on just getting drunk together on weekends. Like when you look at that data and you're able to use that data point in particular to make some really important arguments about what this experience ought to be about, I think that provides some really valuable insight. And those groups that have gotten pushback from their members about substance-free housing policies, that's a really good data point to be able to point to. So SigEp is in league with a couple of other groups. And in fact, the groups that have the highest net promoter scores, we've got a couple of groups that are up around 60. And those are the groups that have had substance-free housing policies in place the longest, for decades. These are the groups who made that change back in the 90s. They have the highest level. So, if you look at that and you say, well, SigEp made that change fairly recently, that we would only expect that satisfaction, net promoter score, to continue to get better as the organization really comes to terms with and embraces that notion of substance-free housing.
Well, it probably, let's be honest. It probably just goes back to, buyer remorse. Or buyer satisfaction, right? So in SigEp land in 2015, we implemented BMP. We did away with pledging across the board. BMP becomes our standard operating model. And then turn around in 17, the undergraduates say, alcohol has a place in the fraternity. We like to party. We like to drink, but it doesn't have a place in our homes. It doesn't have a place in our facilities. We're going to do it somewhere else. And so those were two fairly substantial changes for our organization. Absolutely. But and of course, not surprising, initially there was some red ass. Let's be honest. There were some undergraduates and some chapters that said, well, wait a minute, that's not what I was sold. That's not what I was promised. That's not what I bought.
That's not what I signed up for. Yeah.
That's not what I signed up for. And my response to that was, I think you've got a legitimate gripe. Look, I hate it when I sign up for something and then, a year or two later, they'd say, well, we've decided we're going to change it and change our policies and take something away from you that you thought was important. When I was an undergraduate, alcohol wasn't a huge part of my experience, but I think even I would have been pissed off, because I probably would have said, well, wait a minute, I don't like being told that I can't do, blah, blah, blah. So, but today, fast forward, so 15, 17, today, freshman to senior, all of our members have been recruited under the BMP and substance-free realities. In other words, there's bound to be more consistency and alignment with expectations.
That's right.
Because people are basically getting what they were sold if we're doing a good job with recruitment. And so my theory is that, expectations match reality.
To connect dots, like how you recruit and how you spend that time and what you talk about and how it aligns to the experience, it all matters, because it only enhances belonging, that on base percentage that affects everything else. If you're recruiting with a party and without the understanding of the experience that they're going to get and what matters deeply in the fraternity, and then it's a different experience, they're unsatisfied, they don't have belonging, they're not going to stay. Absolutely. So it all ties together, and it starts with recruitment. Gentry, I wanted to ask you, while we're talking sort of about that recruitment thread, Obviously, we talked about BMP and substance free. We are also one of the groups that focuses on year-round recruitment,
Yep.
and that Rush is 1 week of that, but no, to your point, in Alabama, Nick Saban isn't just recruiting people 1 week a year. No corporation is just selling 1 week a year. We focus on year-round recruitment. So how do other pieces around recruitment, whether that's Rush, recruiting year-round, we also measure the impact of our Balanced Man Scholarship.
Yep.
How does that tie together, and how do we measure that in SigEp? What do we know?
We know a lot, and we know it because of SigEp, right? So SigEp is the group that originally pushed us to begin measuring more things around recruitment, and in particular, a thing that we now measure called motivation to join. And I think the great insight that SigEp has, certainly that Brian Warren, your CEO, has, and this goes back to conversations that he and I began having long before SigEp was a client of ours. I think the great insight that Brian has is that it's impossible for SigEp to be different as a fraternity, to provide a fundamentally different fraternity experience if the people who join SigEp are indistinguishable from the people who are joining other fraternities, right? That's a really profound insight, that if we want to be truly different, that the people who join us have to be looking for something very different. So how do we measure that? We measure that through a thing called motivation to join. And this is something that Brian really pushed us on. And so we developed and piloted and tested and now use very broadly this measure. And what it looks at, it's pretty self-explanatory. What is it you're looking to get out of being in a fraternity? So not SigEp specifically, but just what is your motivation for wanting to be in a fraternity? And there are 4 general motivations that we look at. And this is not to say that these are the only 4, but these are certainly the most common 4. One is about belonging and connection. I'm looking for relationships. I'm looking for a home away from home. One has to do with networking, right? This idea that the relationships I get in a fraternity are going to benefit me both during and after college. There's a leadership and involvement motivation. This idea that joining a fraternity is going to be a good leadership development experience. It's going to help me get plugged into other things on campus. And then the last one is the social benefits motivation, right? This idea that being in a fraternity is going to provide me with the social experience on campus that I want to join. And what we know through research with SigEp, as well as a couple of the other groups, Beta Theta Pi is gathering a lot of this data as well. And there's certainly a peer of you all's. When you all benchmark, I know that's a group that you look at. We've learned a lot about those data points in the last couple of years. So what have we learned? One, that the guys who joined via formal rush and summer rush. So there's a handful of campuses out there where you do a lot of your recruiting over the summer before students even set foot on campus. We've mentioned, and I'll pick on Alabama because I worked there for 5 years, was director of Greek life at Alabama. 90% of the kids who pledge fraternities at Alabama accept a bid before they ever set foot on campus or attend a class, right? Like that's just how they do it. The chapters have pipelines into these high schools and they recruit people they know. They invite kids up for summer rush events and their pledge classes are 90% filled before classes begin in the fall. And in the fall, we just plug in that remaining 10% of guys who are coming from out of state, who don't know anyone, whatever that might be. So that type of rush process delivers the highest percentage of socially motivated joiners. And that's followed closely by formal rush in the fall semester. That who are those guys who show up and in some cases, move in a week early or a few days early before classes to go through formal rush in the fall? These are the guys who know they want to be in fraternities. And these are the guys who tend to be the most motivated by the social experience. The chapters that recruit a higher percentage of their members through, in SigEp world, either year-round informal rush or through the Balanced Man Scholarship Program, have the lowest scores on that social benefits motivation. That's important because those socially motivated joiners, they drink more, They have more problematic attitudes related to hazing. Like all the different metrics that we look at all have the most problematic relationship with the social motivation. So those chapters who get a greater percentage of their members through either balanced man or through informal year-round recruitment have much lower overall scores in terms of social motivation. Those groups also have, and here's connecting the dots to chapter culture, less risk incidents. They have lower numbers of alcohol-related incidents. They have a lower number of insurance claims. So when you look at the dots are not hard to connect at all. The social motivation of the chapters who recruit outside of formal rush is lower. And then as a result, those chapters have fewer alcohol incidents, fewer sexual assault incidents, fewer hazing incidents. You don't have to be, you have to have a PhD to connect those dots, right? They're pretty easy to connect. And there's a straight line between who joins, why they join, and what the culture of the chapter is.
So that's all really interesting. What is it that, can it tell us anything about hazing? I mean, obviously hazing's sort of the bane of the fraternity business, if you will. I mean, we've been efficiently killing each other for far too long and hurting each other and mistreating each other. SigEp obviously has taken some pretty substantial and I think made a tremendous amount of progress in that area. What does the data that you've been referencing tell us about hazing in general, in the propensity to want to haze? I'm assuming it's attached to that, to some kind of social hierarchy that's revealed in the types of questions that you ask.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me start. There's a number of things that we've learned. Let's talk about SigEp Balanced Man program. SigEp is one of a handful of groups that has moved away from a traditional pledging model. So we're able to compare those groups. And so we do this through both, as Heather knows, our organizational data, but then we also do 30 or 40 campus projects a year as well. So we've got data on a lot of national fraternities, right? So, Sigma Nu, for example, is not a client, but I'm sure I have data on 40 or 50 Sigma Nu chapters over the last couple of years, right? Because they have chapters on campuses where we do projects. So I'm able to bring them into a big comparison data set. So when you compare the groups that have non-traditional new member processes to those who do, you see a really distinct difference in some of the hazing motivations that we study and hazing tolerance. So groups that have immediate initiation or some non-traditional member affiliation process, they have lower hazing tolerance scores, which means their members are generally less tolerant of more severe forms of hazing. They have lower, I referenced earlier, that social dominance hazing motivation, this idea that the new member process should be designed to reinforce a hierarchy. Non-traditional groups score much lower than traditional groups on that. And they also score lower on the loyalty commitment motivation. So this idea that the purpose of the new member process is to put people through a difficult process so that they're more committed and loyal to the group at the end, and we weed out those people who aren't loyal and committed. And the differences are significant, right? So we've not released that publicly, although we have put that out there kind of internally within the industry as
here
the
you
NIC.
go, Gentry.
Yeah, well, here we go. I've talked about
Tell the world.
Yeah, but it's not like a white paper or anything. But
let's do that.
But it is out there that sort of thing matters, right? So we know that makes a difference around hazing. That if you change the power dynamic, and that's ultimately my theory on why this is different, is that when you empower the new member, when you basically give him rights within the organization, when you make him a brother, when you give him a voice, when you change that power dynamic that the actives have over the pledges, then those new members are less tolerant of some of the things that those actives might try to do to them, because we've empowered them. We've leveled the playing field. We've given them some voice. We've given them some self-efficacy as it relates to determining what they want their experience to be like. Do you still see hazing in those groups? Yeah, sure. Of course you do. But that hazing tends to be less severe because the new members have more authority. They have more voice to be able to step up and say no. So they might go along with some lower level stuff just to be a good sport about it. But when you ask them to do something dangerous, when you ask them to do something they really don't want to do, they're much more empowered to say, no, I'm not going to do that. Right. And the data definitely bear that out, that there's a significant difference between traditional and non-traditional pledging groups on some of those key metrics that we look at related to hazing. It also connects back to motivation to join, Billy. So when you look at the socially motivated joiners, guess what? They care a lot more about hazing than those who are joining for other reasons, right? So if you care about the social hierarchy, if you care about the social benefits, if you join a fraternity because of its social status, right, its place in kind of the campus social hierarchy, you're going to be much more likely to endorse severe forms of hazing, because there's this idea again that you've got to earn something, right? If you join a group with all these social benefits, we can't just give that away, right? We got to make our new members earn it. And so we see a strong connection there between why people join and ultimately their attitudes around hazing. So getting people who have more altruistic motivations into your pipeline early on, guys who want belonging, leadership and involvement, meaningful connection, that's going to pay dividends down the road when it comes to hazing culture. People are going to be less motivated to want to haze because, again, you've changed the organization by changing the motivations of the people who are there. Why are they there? What are they expecting the experience to be? And then ultimately what we see is that there's a distinct difference between chapters who focus on belonging in their new member process versus those who focus on solidarity in their new member process. And those are two of the aspects of brotherhood. A lot of chapters will say, well, we want a bonded, unified pledge class, but the way they go about doing it is we're going to put these guys through a really difficult experience. And the idea is that they're going to come together as a group to, overcome this difficult experience that we put in front of them. And solidarity does produce commitment and satisfaction and some of those other things that we talked about, but not nearly as well as belonging. And that's the mistake that I probably see most chapters make. And I would assume still see SigEp chapters make this mistake, is that they focus on solidarity instead of focusing on belonging. And the differences are subtle, but they're important. Solidarity is have your brothers back no matter what, right? This idea that we're there for each other, we support each other, and that shows up in good ways, but it can also show up in some problematic ways. Versus belonging is deep, meaningful relationships that are built through authenticity and vulnerability. Here's why it's more important for chapters to understand to focus on belonging instead of solidarity. If you build a sense of belonging among your new members, they feel a deep, meaningful connection to one another. That will, as a result, lead to positive solidarity. They will have each other's back. They will be there for one another in positive and meaningful ways. But if you only focus on solidarity, this idea of you're going to go through a difficult process, you're going to come together, you're going to bond as a group, it doesn't go both ways. Solidarity does not necessarily yield those deep, meaningful connections and that sense of belonging. And that's the mistake that I see most fraternities make, is that they want commitment, they want meaningful relationships, they want the right things, but they go about it in the absolute wrong way. They think that solidarity will lead to belonging, and it doesn't go that way, but it does go in the other direction. Good belonging does lead to positive solidarity. So really getting chapters to understand the difference between those two things and to embrace building belonging and to kind of move away from this idea of pledge class solidarity, pledge class unity achieved through oftentimes hazing, right? We're going to put you through that hard, difficult new member process with the expectation that you're going to come together. The chapters who make that switch are going to yield some significant benefits from making that change.
Yeah, it's a bit of a fraternity hack, isn't it? I mean, it's like cheating.
Absolutely.
Right? The way to cut a corner. I mean, if you, let's be honest, it's harder work to work on belonging. I mean, it takes it, and there are more risks associated with it, right? Risks of, when we make ourselves vulnerable, which is the definition of a relationship, right? I'm risking that you might reject me. You might not like me. You might not stick with me. That's harder work. In solidarity, it is more of a military, term. I mean, how to leave no one behind. Have your the band of brothers, have your guys back. And there's a reason the military does it, right? But fraternities cheat when they focus on solidarity versus. And it's so interesting to hear you say that the data suggests that, because I found that in my own professional and personal life, that when you focus on belonging and there are relationships, solidarity is very often a naturally occurring derivative.
Absolutely.
Of that. And that in organizations or other things I've participated in where it's been less about brotherhood, or less about belonging, or less about transparency and authenticity, me coming fully as I am, and you loving and accepting me as I am. And we focus on, skip that part. Let's just all agree that we have got each other's back, and we're gonna, come hell or high water. I mean, we're gonna stick together. Well, that's nice if we're going to war together, but I don't think, or at least I hope, SigEps aren't going to war together anytime soon. So in the meantime, I think that's a terrific wisdom. Again, generated from years of collecting data, that our chapters and our coaches and mentors who work with undergraduates could really, really reinforce that. It's a nuanced view of fraternalism, but gosh, there's some power inside of that little data point.
To Billy's point, as we're thinking about, okay, what do our volunteers need to take away? What do our undergraduates need to take away? Like, at a very basic level, to have big goals and to get the chapter rally around those.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean? That you understand the goal is brotherly love, or that you understand the goal is your men's development, and to care about each other, that to have big goals, to get the chapter rowing in the same direction towards those, so that everything else supports those versus solidarity.
Any sort of important goal. Heather, I think about, I was at a DU convention a couple of years ago, and it struck me that there's a group, it was either Kansas State or Bradley. It's one of the sweepstakes winning chapters. And they get up on stage, and they're sweepstakes winning, and they've been sweepstakes finalists for years and years. Just one of those really high performing chapters, and they win chapter of the year, whatever the award is, and they're up there and they're so excited, and you can tell how strong their brotherhood is, and you're like, what a perfect example of, like, they've got a goal. They want to be the best fraternity in the realm. And they work towards that. And so much of their identity is built around that. And they have such a sense of positive solidarity around this idea of being the best fraternity chapter, right? And it shows, it's obvious in how those groups show up. Having a goal outside of your chapter, having something that you're working towards, what that does to build those meaningful connections and that positive sense of solidarity. Because if you have that really explicit external thing you're working towards, then you don't have to beat your pledges into having solidarity. Like, it comes naturally, because we all know we're all on the same page about what the goal is and about what we're working towards. I think there's some really profound learning that we can learn from, sociological research that was done 100 years ago.
Well, solidarity sucks all the oxygen out of the room. That's been my experience. I mean, right? If solidarity is the goal, it becomes all encompassing, all consuming. I mean, because it's life or death, right? Solidarity. I mean, you're either with the team or against the team. When everything becomes black and white, all the shades of gray get lost, and all the nuances and all the beautiful, the beautiful subtext of fraternalism gets lost when it's all about having each other's back. It just sucks all the oxygen out of the room. And I think, again, your comments on that are just super helpful. So Gentry, this is a long one today. So let me wrap it up a little bit selfishly. So as the Grand President, I'm the chair of SigEp's board, and a lot of people think I run the fraternity. I do not. Brian Warren and Heather and their team run the fraternity day to day. My job as chair of the board and the job of my fellow board members is to be strategic and to think long term. It's hard to do. It's not sexy, but it's super important. So we're focusing on things 10 years, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years from now. Trying to predict the future is risky business, to be sure, but you got to do it. You got to be thinking about where we're headed. What are the likely trends? What are the things that are likely to happen? Because how we spend our resources and our time and deploy our human talent today is going to have repercussions, right? So we always talk about, we plant trees today that we will likely never enjoy the shade from, but others will. And so as the chair of the SigEp board, and on behalf of my fellow board members, where is fraternity going? And how does SigEp position itself, I think, both to stand out and be immune to some of the more concerning trends? Anything your data can tell me about 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now, I know it's educated guessing, and I know that the data is constantly trending in one direction or the other. But if I had to hire you as a futurist on behalf of SigEp, what kinds of 2, 3, 4 things might you drop that would be pearls of wisdom I could take back to my board and really get some juju going?
The first thing that comes to mind, Billy, is that the data are clear that the fraternity experience overall is becoming more and more social in nature. And COVID only highlighted and in some cases exacerbated that trend, right? So people care more about the social aspect. They care more about their chapter's place in the social hierarchy. They're drinking more, just everything related to the social aspect of membership is trending in a problematic direction. SigEp so far seems to be bucking that trend a little bit, right? And that's helpful. But I think, as you think about 10, 15, 20 years from now, if that trend in the interfraternal world continues, the experience increasingly becomes more and more social. And those guys who, here's how I think about it. I think when I was in school, 20 years ago when I joined a fraternity, there were a lot of people who joined fraternities because they saw it as a valuable leadership, involvement, engagement, get plugged in on campus type experience. And when I travel around and I work with chapters and just looking at the data and doing the work that I do, I think there's a lot less of those types of people joining fraternities, that if it's become increasingly social. And so the guys who are joining are increasingly joining for the social experience. And you've got a higher concentration of those guys and a lower concentration of guys who are there for more altruistic reasons. Well, that has profound impact on a chapter and the culture of a chapter. So how do you empower, train, equip your chapters to go out and find those guys who are not interested in the social experience, but might be interested in all the other more altruistic stuff, right? So, the brotherly love that you talked about, the leadership, the service, whatever you want it to be, how we are equipping chapters to go out and identify and recruit and get those men to join, I think is the most important thing, right? And the good news is that you all know that, and you're already doing a lot along those lines. And I think that work is incredibly important because the data tells us that in general, the guys joining are increasingly primarily interested in the social experience. So how we find those people who are interested in something else is going to be critical to building something that's different.
So let me interrupt then.
Yeah.
So just from a business perspective, if I'm chair of the board, I would take what you just said. I'd go back to my board and I'd say, look, the data suggests that we are experiencing cause and effect. And if cause and effect is real in our market, we have to define our brand, have to understand our brand, and we have to ruthlessly execute our brand. across the organization. And if we fail to do that, then the gravitational pull, if you will, from the broader pulls of what's going on in our society, what's going on post-COVID, what's going on in the world is going to pull us in a direction that we absolutely don't want to go.
Yep, absolutely. The other trend that I'm seeing emerge in our data has to do with inclusion and our chapters and where our chapters are located. That groups tend to have a type of campus that they gravitate towards. If I'm thinking about building a lasting, diverse, multi-ethnic, truly inclusive fraternity experience, part of that conversation has to be around the campuses where we're going and adding chapters. There was an article that came out recently from a think tank, and I'm forgetting the name of the think tank right now, but it proposed a new system of ranking college campuses. And what the system they used, they basically called it an economic mobility index. So right now, when you look at the U.S. News and World Report, it's selectivity and endowment and the privileged getting more and more privileged every year. What this research suggested was, instead of looking at all those things, is that you look at how well colleges do at moving people from the lower class to the middle class, or from the middle class to the upper class, right? That you look at basically how long does it take you to recoup the investment that you made in the in your college education, and then to look at the magnitude to which you're doing that, right? Based on the percentage. What they used as a multiplier was a percentage of Pell eligible students that were on those campuses. And using their formula, what you find is that a lot of the schools that perform really well are historically Hispanic serving institutions. And I did a little homework before I got on here. They listed a top 50 of these institutions. SigEp has a couple of chapters at those institutions. And when you look at those chapters, they look remarkably different from a lot of your other chapters. They have really low risk scores. They're not partying a lot. They're not drinking a lot. It's not about the social experience. And belonging, affinity, brotherly love, all that stuff we talked about, through the roof in these chapters, right? Really, really high. These chapters do really, really well. And they're at predominantly Hispanic serving institutions. And when we look at your numbers, I was playing around with some of the demographics. You all are as diverse, and in some cases more diverse than some of the other chapters that we work with. When you look at your Hispanic numbers, what you find is a more or less even smattering of Hispanic members across most of your chapters, but then a handful of chapters where you've got a really high percentage, 30, 40, 50% of the members of a chapter are Hispanic. And those chapters look drastically different from your other chapters. It's pretty fascinating. So when I'm future casting, what am I looking at? I'm looking at changing enrollment trends. I'm looking at campuses where fraternity is dying, frankly, where the experience is rapidly changing, and you've got groups that are trying to offer an experience that was relevant 20 years ago, but is no longer relative to students on that campus. So if I'm a fraternity and I want to continue to grow, and I want to promote brotherly love, and I want to do all the things that SigEp is trying to do, I start thinking very seriously about the profile of the campuses to which I'm expanding, because there are a lot of campuses out there that a lot of national fraternities are frankly ignoring. They're not paying attention to, but I think are incredibly fertile ground for fraternities to go and build the type of meaningful brotherhood that you want to build. And we're just not paying much attention to them. But when we look at those places where SigEp has planted a flag, those chapters are doing really, really well. They may not be your biggest chapters. I didn't even look at the chapter size of some of those groups, but when you look at the quality of the experience, those groups are having a really, really good experience. And so I think that's an important thing to consider moving forward.
Enough, they do very well with size. they do well on their campus. Because they look like their campus. They are a reflection.
That's right.
Of their campus. And I think that's another great message. You know, we've got to go back, and our board needs to understand we're growing, right? We're consuming a lot of calories right now as an organization. We're going to put on some weight. We don't want them to be empty calories. And there's a just a natural male testosterone driven inclination to want to go to the big fancy universities on a hill where we might not have a chapter at the moment, and to go back there and stake our claim. And I think what you're suggesting is that, well, maybe if we're serious about being a franchisor and producing results and ruthlessly executing that brand, we should be very intentional about where we decide we're going to spend our resources, because there are some places in America that really want what SigEp has to offer.
Yep.
And we ain't there, and
Yep.
we need to get there as soon as we can.
100%.
Love it. Love it. Well, I've got my marching orders. I've got a whole page. I guess I think I probably speak for Heather when I say this is just terrific. I hope our viewers have learned as much as I have today. I appreciate the work that you do. It's a great partnership between SigEp and you and your organization. We're glad to be a part of it. I will assure you that the data that you produce is being looked at and considered with every decision that the board makes. And I know that the staff uses it as a North Star as well. So a much thanks to you, Gentry, for taking time out to spend with us today. And we hope to have you back in the future, probably under a new Grand President, hopefully talking about how SigEp continues to grow and improve.
Thank you. It was a pleasure being on here, and we love the partnership with SigEp and just appreciate the forward thinking and great work that you all are doing. It's fun to get to use our data and see groups using our data in a way that's producing such a meaningful fraternity experience. So thank you for the good work that you all are doing, and enjoyed the conversation. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks, everyone.
And thank you, Heather, as always. And we always end with a SigEp superlative. We're not going to do that today because this was about data, so there aren't any really SigEp chapters out there doing data. I will end, as I always do, by saying it is a privilege and a great day to be a SigEp, and we'll catch you on the backside.